Escape from the Renon Empire by Elton Gar. It had taken Miric 4 years to earn the trust of the Lords of Renon and be allowed to enter the breeding room. It had taken 2 more to convince them he could be trusted without supervision. During that time, he had spent every day trying to better understand the Renon. He would never be a part of their society. It was impossible for a human to be accepted into Renon society, just as it was impossible for the average Renon to become a noble. And Miric was now alone in the room with the secret that made all of that possible. The Hemolocks were small for something so important. The largest were barely bigger than his hand. They looked a bit like tiny men, with arms, legs, and a short, thick tail that all stuck out of the thick blue shell that protected their body. Miric had only been allowed the privilege of drinking alcohol mixed with the shavings of those shells once. He had been stronger, smarter, and healthier for several days. Even the ache in his knees had gone away, and it hadn't returned. He had considered simply killing the animals. There were only a couple of hundred, but several of the more powerful lords of Renon had their own Hemolock breeding stock, so it would hurt the Empire, but it wouldn't eliminate the Renon Lords. It would only give more power to those who already had it. So he would level the battleground. He had prepared a small hidden compartment in his backpack, and now that he was alone, he slipped a nest along with the Hemolock and almost 2 dozen eggs into the compartment. The Hemolock was clearly upset as she squawked at him, but once she was reunited with her eggs, she calmed and began to reorganize her nest. Miric carefully packed the rest of the pouch with the small nuts that were the Hemolock's preferred food, while the mother Hemolock reorganized her eggs and tightened the weave of the nest. It seemed she understood she would move and didn't want to risk her eggs. Miric just hoped she was right as he sewed the small flap over the compartment. He then put the pack over his shoulder and faced the chance that the last 10 years would be a waste, his life forfeit, and his kingdom made part of the Renon Empire. Perhaps not in his lifetime, but the advantage the Hemolock gave was simply too great. Directly outside of the breeding room stood 8 Renon guards. Common Renon were a couple of inches shorter than the average human, with large eyes, huge hands, and covered in long, hard feathers. Miric had thought those feathers were decorative or like hair until the first time he had sparred with a Renon. Each of the feathers had a strong central shaft, almost the size of a finger, and they were tightly packed enough to armor them. You could hurt a Renon with a blunt weapon if you were strong enough, but blades would rarely reach their skin. It also allowed them to survive temperatures humans needed clothes and fire to survive. When their empire had been smaller, those feathers had been a huge advantage, making Renon soldiers effectively armored while human armies had to spend time and effort crafting armor. The guards asked him a few basic questions. Yes, he was allowed in the breeding chamber. No, he wasn't taking anything out. Yes, they could search his bag. No, he wasn't planning to leave the city. It was routine, and he often went out drinking with these same guards, but they still went through his things carefully. Anyone trusted enough to guard this door knew how important it was to remain vigilant. Miric tried his best to look bored rather than terrified. The biggest danger came when a guard turned the bag almost entirely over. Miric expected the Hemolock to chatter in anger. The pouch was padded, and the eggs were more solid than a bird egg, but that didn't mean they enjoyed being bounced around. But nothing happened. Likely the mother had retracted into her shell rather than making noise. Once done being searched, Miric did his best to turn the pack upright slowly as to not rattle them too much, but he couldn't stop to reorganize the Hemolock. The path he followed took him past the entrance of the council room of the Lords of Renon. As he neared the huge ornate chamber, Lord Leon approached. The Renon Lord was one of the lower-ranked lords, but he was from old nobility and had been ingesting the shells of the Hemolock for his entire life. Because of that, he was a foot taller than the average Renon, almost 6'6", and his feathers had a green-blue tint only seen in nobility. He carried a long, thin sword on his belt. More a status symbol than a true weapon, but it was designed to slip through the feather armor of a Renon. Something Miric had seen when Lord Leon had stabbed a common Renon 2 years ago because she had failed to show the proper deference. Miric moved out of the way of the Lord. The Renon didn't have ritualized forms of respect like humans. You could bow and they would accept it as what should be done, but they wouldn't be upset when you didn't the next time.
Miric, what brings you to the chamber today? Another request for the humans of the city?
The Lord said. Miric felt guilt at abandoning the human population in the city. They would be punished for his crime, but he had never asked to be made one of their leaders, and he had sent out messages telling them to flee the city. Yet he also understood why they had asked him so often to bring requests to the Council of Lords. They were former slaves or the children of slaves with no standing and barely any education, while Miric was treated better than the common Renon.
I was feeding the Hemolock. They seem a little restless today,
Miric said. Lord Leon wouldn't check on the Hemolock. The people who cared for the Hemolock answered to his servants.
It is nearly hatching season, or so I understand. Perhaps you'll be picked to be a lord this season,
Lord Leon said. He chuckled the high-pitched bird-like laugh of the Renon. But it wasn't entirely a joke. He had been allowed to drink of some Hemolock shell because several of the lower-ranked lords believed adding a human to the council would be useful. As their empire grew, the number of humans in it also grew, and they were becoming restless. It might have been a tempting path for Miric if there had ever been a chance of it happening, but finding it funny was one of the more mild reactions.
I have never seen them hatch,
Miric said.
Come back in a few days. Separating the hemlock from their children takes time, and we have to feed the hatchlings until they can take care of themselves,
Lord Leon said. It was more information than he had gotten before, though it seemed to him it would be easier to let their parents feed them than to separate them.
I will do that,
Miric said. Lord Leon turned and walked away, seeming to forget Miric existed. Miric relaxed once he was alone. He had been expecting the Hemolock in his pack to make a noise while he was talking to Lord Leon, but she had remained silent. Miric wanted to rush to the gate and race back to his kingdom, but he was a human, so it wasn't that easy. He also couldn't return to his home. If they discovered a Hemolock was gone, he would be the prime suspect. So he went to the room he had rented, deep in the human slums. He had picked that inn because it was connected to the Undercity, a series of basements and tunnels that had interconnected in a web that covered the entire city. They were amazed that no one knew fully, but among their most useful feature was that they led from the inner city to the outer. Miric had explored them for years. That was how he had found a series of tunnels leading to the inn. Its entrance was a clothing shop near the palace, and the path went through two different warehouses, a woman's basement, and a section of drainage ditches all connected by small hand-carved tunnels. All of that made him certain, when he climbed up the ladder into the kitchen of the inn, no one knew where he was. A couple of young Renon working in the kitchen watched him, but in neighborhoods like this, people knew to keep quiet. But even if they didn't, there wouldn't be that much for them to talk about. Someone coming out of the Undercity wasn't unusual, and while humans were the minority in most of the city, they outnumbered the Renon 2-to-1 in the slums. The trip through the inn without being seen was the hardest part. But once he was up the stairs, he locked himself in the room he had rented for the week. He put his pack on the largest of the boxes of supplies he had moved into the room and opened it, then opened the secret compartment. As soon as the small Hemolock looked up out of the mess and saw him, she pulled her head out of her shell and began to make irritated squeaking sounds.
I know. I'm sorry. I didn't know they'd turn you upside down,
Miric said, and he poured a bit of water from his water skin into a small bowl and handed it to her. She took it carefully and stopped making noise as she drank. That was good. It was unlikely anyone would hear her, but he wanted to avoid risk. The plan was simple. 2 days from now, he was scheduled to meet a Renon he had paid to lead him through the Undercity to the other side of the inner wall. The first day, he spent his time repacking his pack and eating as much as he could to prepare for his trip. Then the eggs began to hatch. As soon as the eggs cracked, the Hemolock mother pulled away the shells. She made hissing noises at Miric when he reached down until she saw he was carefully removing a piece of shell that had trapped one of the Hemolock babies. After that, she was a bit more friendly, though she still watched him carefully. He understood. She must know the Renon took her children. The children were smaller than he expected, from the size of the eggs. They grabbed onto the back of their mother's shells and held on. With so many children holding onto her, she moved slowly, and Miric handed her a nut to make it easier. While doing that, he saw something odd. The babies were sucking and chewing on the edges of her shell. But the more he thought about that, the more sense it made. The effects of the Hemolock shells didn't exist for no reason. They were how they fed their infants. Miric left the Hemolock with a bit of water and went to meet with his Renon contact. As he moved down busy city streets, he saw several of the Renon watching him. So he wasn't surprised when his contact said,
"What have you gotten me into, human?"
I doubt you want to know.
Miric said.
Half the city is looking for a human that fits your description. I don't know if it's you, and I don't want to know, but my price just doubled.
The Renon said. Miric didn't know the Renon's name, just like he didn't know Miric's, and that was better for both of them. He pulled out a bag and put 4 large gold coins down, and slid them across the table to the Renon. That was more than twice the agreed-upon fee, but what money he had wouldn't matter once he escaped the city. The Renon moved the coins from the table to his coin purse and said,
Are we leaving from here?
The inn I'm staying in is a couple of blocks over. I'll take you there, but I hope you'll understand why I'll need you to stay with me and not talk to anyone until we're outside of the walls.
Miric said. The Renon smiled and said,
It's always good to work with a professional, but I will warn you, I'll be reporting everything as soon as I return to the inner city.
Miric had known that, but he appreciated the respect of being told, so he did his best to return the favor.
Do it someplace you have a significant advantage and have an escape plan.
Miric said. He knew the Renon was likely to assume it was an attempt to keep him from giving away the information, but that didn't mean he wouldn't follow the advice. Collecting the Hemolock, he noticed the babies had already grown. They were still much smaller than their mother, but their eyes were open. He explained to the mother that they needed to move again, and was a bit surprised when she moved the babies inside her shell. He wasn't sure how much that would protect them, but it suggested she understood. He put on the pack, tightening the strap that went around his waist so the pack would bounce less. He then slipped into the kitchen and down the ladder, and a few hours later followed the Renon up a narrow set of wooden stairs into an abandoned home. He thanked him, then gave him another gold to get a few drinks before he went back into the inner city. Miric had never seen the gate to the outer city guarded, but today Renon guards were pulling humans out of the line and searching them. He hadn't counted on that, so he stopped at one of the small outdoor restaurants near the gate and bought soup. He watched the crowds until a merchant with a wagon got into the line. He whistled in a way that the Renon couldn't easily emulate, and waved the merchant over. He couldn't explain his need for help, but he offered him the last of his coins for a ride. The merchant understood a gold coin was a massive overpayment, but he agreed, and Miric carefully hid his pack among the trade goods. He was searched as he went through the gate, and for a moment he was certain he would be arrested and his pack would leave the city with the merchant. But in the end the Renon let him go, and he hopped back onto the wagon. The 2 mules pulling the heavy cart moved slower than Miric could walk, but he was exhausted and fell asleep in the back of the wagon that continued late into the night. Then without warning or goodbye, Miric slipped off the back of the wagon and was once again on his own. The Renon roads weren't as abandoned at night as a human road would be. The Renon could see better in the dark. But that didn't help Miric, who kept on the road by the feel of the stone under his feet. It was nearly sunrise when he saw the thick forest with edges that could barely be seen from the road. The Renon avoided forests even more than humans. They barely used firewood thanks to their thick feathers, and much of their construction was made of stone. So once he was enveloped by the forest, he felt almost safe, and in his exhaustion, he found a thick thorn bush and slid into the small ditch under it. Once safely hidden away, he opened his pack and got another earful of squeaks from the mother Hemolock. But once he poured her 3 cups of water, the third which she gave to the babies, she relaxed. Miric would have to find a source of clean water soon, but sharing with the Hemolock wouldn't change that. When he woke, he discovered the Hemolock had climbed out of his bag and gathered several twigs and thorns from the branches of the bushes. Seeing what she was doing, Miric broke off more of the twigs and handed them to her. Some she tossed away, seeming to find some flaw in them, but others she used, weaving the twigs together so that they created much higher walls to her nest, while leaving a gap just big enough for her to squeeze through to get more nuts. The advantage seemed clear. As he bounced around, the nest would be more secure. While she continued, Miric explored. His sleeping spot wasn't comfortable, but it was secure, so rather than waste time looking for something better, he dug out the ditch so he could stretch out more. He wasn't sure how long he would hide here, but he needed to let enough time pass that the Renon would stop their search, so he gathered food to supplement supplies. He offered a few berries to the Hemolock, who looked at them carefully, then put them in with the nuts. She would supplement her food too, so he continued to share everything he gathered. All the while, the Hemolock children continued to grow faster than he would have expected. That was a problem. His hidden compartment could hold 1 Hemolock and some eggs, but not a dozen, and they were acting strangely. Each day while he hunted, they worked to expand the small ditch and began to build nests in small holes. The children also became louder and grew shells. And Miric began to hear more than just random noises. It was almost a language. A month later, the Hemolock children were as big as their mother, though their shells were still thin and Miric was beginning to relax. Then he spotted a small group of Renon. At their front was a noble Miric didn't recognize. But his size, feathers, and uniform marked him as dangerous. But there was nothing Miric could do. Trying to escape would just make it easier for the scout to find him. So he laid in his hole under the bush and hoped the Renon would move on. That night, something unexpected happened. A Hemolock child woke him, pulling at his hand. There were 2 other Hemlock already in his pack, along with 24 eggs of various shades in his pack. He hadn't known the children were old enough to lay eggs, but these came from more than just one Hemolock. Once awake, the mother Hemolock handed him something else. Her tiny cup filled not with water, but tiny shavings from her shell. Miric looked at it for a moment, and then poured it into his water skin, and handed her back the tiny cup. Renon nodded to the Hemolock, who would stay behind, including the mother, and said,
"Thank you. I will protect them to the best of my abilities."
In the dark, he stumbled through the woods, fully aware that the Renon Lord could likely see as clearly as he could in daylight. As he moved, he took a sip from his water skin. It was bitter, reminding him why the Renon put the shavings in alcohol. But it was worth it. At first, it was energy and strength, but within an hour, he could see well enough to follow the narrow path. His mind was the last to change. Mostly, it told him things he would have already known had the fear and exhaustion not been driving him. The most important was that he was leaving a clear trail. But he also saw ways to make it more difficult. Each time the trail split, he did his best to confuse the scout. He'd break twigs on the wrong path or overturn rocks. At one point, he even took off his shoes and put them on backwards. It wasn't comfortable, but it looked as if he was walking in the opposite direction. As the sun came up, Miric fell into a steady pace he hoped to keep for the next few days until he reached his homeland. But then he glanced back and saw the Renon Lord behind him. The other Renon had been left behind, unable to keep up, but the noble had caught up. Miric almost surrendered. The Renon Lords were lords because of their many advantages. Strength, stamina, rejuvenation, and a life of training gave him every advantage, as did the thick feather armor. And while Miric had some advantages from his recent dose of shell, it wouldn't make up for a lifetime of using it. He decided to fight. You could never be certain of the outcome of a fight until it had happened. That made giving up before it started a mistake. So he hung his pack on a nearby tree where it might not be noticed. He then found a solid branch. As a weapon, it was nearly as useless as his own hands against the padding of the Renon's feathers, but it made him feel better. The Renon Lord didn't speed up as he approached Miric. He simply drew his dagger and continued to approach. He was like all Renon Lords, taller and stronger looking than the average Renon, but he was less stout and more fit than the council members. This wasn't someone who spent his days sitting around ordering other people to work. He had chosen one of the most dangerous jobs in the army, even though he need not serve, and for that at least Miric respected him.
You have stolen from the Lords of Renon.
And you have attacked peaceful kingdoms and enslaved entire populations. I feel no guilt for freeing some of those slaves,
Miric said. He didn't expect to live out the hour, but he would at least get to tell one Renon Lord what he thought of them.
And thanks to you, we will have no choice but to increase our assaults on your people. We can no longer trust that you have not stolen our advantage.
He had always known that danger. There would be war. And without the Hemolocks to let the human commanders at least match wits with the Lords of Renon, the humans wouldn't have a chance. He didn't say any of that. He simply waited for the Renon Lord to approach, then jabbed at him with the long club-like stick. As he swung, he saw the Hemolocks climbing to the edge of the pack to watch the fight. He would not live, but perhaps the Hemolocks at least could be free. So he drew his own knife, tossing away the meager defense that the stick had given him. The Renon rushed forward. Miric didn't defend himself. He simply stabbed back, his slender knife sliding between feathers. As both collapsed, the pain receded, and for a moment Miric thought he had won. But as the shock receded, the pain returned. A moment later, Miric felt the Hemolocks trying to put his water skin into his hand. They were barely big enough to drag it along the ground. Miric was thirsty, and brought it up to his mouth, and then almost spit out the bitter-tasting water. His mind was foggy, but he knew he should drink it. At first he didn't think it did any good, but soon he began to feel better. He then pulled the Renon's knife from his side, took several more deep gulps of water, and collapsed in exhaustion. He woke with 3 Hemolocks squalling at him. They were bigger than their mother, and smarter. He understood now why the Renon separated the Hemolocks from their parents at birth. The same shells that made the Renon stronger did the same for the Hemolocks. Miric did not know how much larger, stronger, or smarter they would get, but as he helped them back into the pack, he had his suspicions. He had been trying to save his own people, but he had the chance to save another as well. And as he slowly began to move towards the border of his kingdom, he knew what he had to do. He would insist they treat the Hemolocks as allies rather than slaves, and with the Hemolocks' help, they would defend his homeland, and perhaps someday they could free the rest of the Hemolocks.
Author's note. A while back, I heard about the theft of silkworms from China. The basics of the story is that 2 monks slipped out of the country with the worms in hollow canes. Whether that is true or even accurate to the story, it was interesting to me. At the beginning of the creation of this story, it was going to be more or less that simple. A man stealing a magical animal and returning it to his kingdom. But this is fantasy, and so I added more details. The first was that the animal produced a magical drug, one that made you smarter, stronger, and healthier. The logical next question was why they made it. And the answer seemed simple. It was to strengthen their children. That allowed me to make the villains of the story much worse and increase the stakes. Although you don't see the end of this story play out, I hope Miric is right and humans are better than the Renon, that they won't choose to exploit the Hemolocks in the same way. But there is a reason that most of the Hemolocks didn't go with him. They're smart enough to know that they can't trust humans, but they're also smart enough to know that they need allies. And the Hemolocks will grow both in size and intelligence quickly in the wild. Hopefully, that will be enough. If you enjoyed this story, you can come to www.sci-fi.com and discover more of my work. I have several novels and many more short stories. And if you sign up for my newsletter, you'll not only get a free book, but I'll send a short weekly newsletter each with more free stories. Thanks for your time. Elton Gar.